Sure. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here with us today on Zoom. I want to thank Esther and Natalia specifically. Welcome to, I think this is our first Zoom event of the year for the Laboratory for the Study of Philanthropy, Solidarity, and Care, Solid Care Lab here at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. We are very happy to host Esther Sharma today, who will be talking to us about her research with Afghan refugees and childbearing experiences of Afghan refugees on their route to EU through Serbia, birthing on the way. Just give you a few insights on Esther. Esther is a UK midwife. She worked in the UK National Health Service for 15 years in both clinical and management health roles. She also worked voluntarily in Afghanistan and has completed a master's in public health at the London School of Medicine, where she is currently completing her doctoral research and undertaking a PhD study about perinatal experiences of Afghan women in Serbia. We are very happy to have Esther here and talk about her research. Afterwards, Dr. Natalia Perisic will be our moderator and discussant for Esther. So she will kick off the conversation, and then we will open the floor to all of you. Thank you so much for joining to our discussion, and hopefully we will learn something together. And well, I'm looking forward to the discussion. So Esther, as far as I'm concerned, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Liliana and Natalia, and thank you so much to the Solid Care Lab for hosting this event. Just before I start, there are just a couple of things I wanted to mention. I'm aware there's a mix of both academics and people who work in practice settings in various roles outside academia attending today. So I will kind of aim to make this as relevant as possible to both academics and those outside academia who are attending. I'm also very aware that some of you will be extremely familiar with the context of refugees in Serbia, and others of you will be very much more familiar with issues of childbearing in Serbia. But really, during the course of this webinar, I really hope to be able to bring together these two issues to show how they interact. I also just want to acknowledge those who have worked on both the topic of refugees in Serbia and on childbearing in Serbia, whose important work this project builds upon, and also all the participants who gave their time and shared their stories and experiences with me, which is what I'll be sharing with you today. And finally, I'd like to thank my PhD supervisors, Dr. Diane Duclos and Dr. Natasha Howard at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, whose support for this project has been really invaluable. So I'll start just by giving a brief background to Afghan mobility. Afghans have a long-standing history of global mobility for trading and also for military purposes, and so have really well-established transnational ties. And so to some extent, mobility is a normal way of life for Afghans. However, decades of instability and conflict, as well as natural disasters such as landslides, flooding, and earthquakes, has led to large-scale internal and international displacement, which I'll refer to throughout this presentation as forced displacement or forced migration. Although I do recognise that any type of mobility is hugely complex, with multiple and overlapping motivations for migration. So at present, the UNHCR estimates there are currently 6.4 million Afghans in refugee-like situations, and neighbouring Iran and Pakistan have hosted the largest number of displaced Afghans. So thinking specifically about Afghans wanting to travel to Europe to seek protection, as we're all well aware, because of the lack of legal and safe routes, Afghans often have no alternative option than having to migrate without state authorization, taking unsafe overland journeys. These journeys typically involve traveling through Iran, Turkey, and across the Mediterranean to Greece, and then through Balkan countries to Serbia or Bosnia, which are on the peripheries of the EU, and then either into the Schengen zone via Hungary or Croatia. But in reality, the travel is far less linear and clear-cut than this portrays, as I will discuss later in the presentation. This overland journey is referred to by Afghans as Game Zadan, which means the game. And it's very common for people to engage people smugglers to help to facilitate journeys. And these journeys are typically often very protracted and staged as borders are renegotiated and funds are required to pay smugglers for each section of the journey. Serbia has become an established passageway into the EU. On entry to Serbia, people have the option to register with authorities and stay in state-organised refugee camps. But many do choose to travel through Serbia without registering, staying in squats outside camps, hoping that this will expedite their journeys rather than staying in camps, which can slow them down. A lot of migrants do get stuck or stranded in Serbia and EU border countries, and there are several reasons for this. Firstly, as a deterrent to entering the EU, EU border police conduct what's known as pushbacks to keep people away from EU borders. And these pushbacks occur when people are forced back across the border that they've crossed, often very violently. There's also a poorly functioning Serbian asylum system, which makes it difficult for those who want to seek protection in Serbia to do so. And as a result of all of these factors and others, it often leads to very circuitous journeys as border crossings are repeatedly attempted and negotiated and renegotiated in different locations. Now, for many women, pregnancy and birth continue during these migratory journeys, but we have very, very little data about this. There is, in fact, a complete lack of sex disaggregated data, let alone data on those who are pregnant or give birth along the way. So what do we know about the impact of forced displacement on the perinatal period? When I talk about perinatal, the definitions do vary, but what I'm referring to here is a definition from conception to the first 6 weeks after birth. We do know that forced migration is highly gendered. Women and girls are affected by conflict in specific ways. During migratory journeys, women and girls are at risk of sexual violence and trafficking. Refugee camps, rather than being safe havens, often reproduce gender-based violence. And the asylum process for those who are seeking international protection is arguably very male-centric, making it difficult for women to achieve settlement on their own grounds. There's really inconclusive evidence on the impact of forced displacement on obstetric or newborn outcomes. Some research shows that perinatal outcomes are worse for forcibly displaced women, but this is unclear, as often studies include a mix of migrant types, making it really difficult to compare across studies. However, it does seem that there is some evidence showing worsened perinatal mental health for refugee women, and this in turn can have a detrimental impact on bonding and attachment with their newborns. Pauline Binder has coined the term the maternal migration effect, which she uses to describe the impact of home country maternity experiences on host country maternity experiences. I suggest and argue that this can be broadened to include the impact of experiences during journeys on host country maternity experiences as well. So it's really important for those providing perinatal care to refugee women to have an understanding of what women may have experienced in their home countries or during migration. So thinking specifically about the maternity context in Afghanistan or for Afghan women on the way, Afghanistan has consistently had some of the world's highest maternal and newborn mortality rates, although huge gains have been made over the past 20 years. Now, under Taliban rule, women are not allowed to leave the home without a male chaperone, and this really impacts women's access to maternity care services, as well as making it difficult for female maternal healthcare professionals to go to their places of work. And maternity facilities face enormous under-resourcing, all of which negatively impact the quality of maternity care that women receive in Afghanistan. I want to read this quote because when I talk about childbearing, I really want to talk about something that goes beyond just the biomedical understanding of childbearing and the impact of forced migration on just the biomedical um, aspect of childbearing. So I'm going to read this quote because I think it sums up really nicely why it's so important to think beyond the biomedical. And it's from Rachel Chadwick. And she says, birth is always embedded, emergent, and in relation to sociocultural norms, local material structures, physiologies, intersectional and transnational relations of power. Birth is situated at the crossroads of body, socio-materiality, physiology, discourse, language, and geopolitics. And this is very much what I've tried to encapsulate in this research project. So just to briefly outline the aims of my research project, which is written out on the slide, but essentially it was to explore the experiences of Afghan women in Serbia during the perinatal period, with a focus on understanding their interactions with and the provision of maternity care. And I collected I used multiple methods of data collection and analysis in this study to really try and provide and capture a rich and layered understanding of Afghan women's perinatal experiences. So firstly, the first question I really wanted to consider was thinking about the contextual factors that women experience in Serbia. So I asked, what are the circumstances in Serbia that shape Afghan women's perinatal experiences? Now, just to start with, I didn't really ask women specifically the circumstances under which they left Afghanistan, but several women did talk about it. And they spoke about how a crisis in their own personal safety or their family safety in Afghanistan precipitated a sudden decision to leave. Both women who mentioned that were pregnant at the time. And the journeys that women took were really journeys marked by a huge amount of suffering. Journeys were extremely lengthy. The majority of women already had one or more child with them during the journey, and many were already pregnant too, either when they left Afghanistan or became pregnant at some point during the journey. Pretty much all Afghan women I spoke with travelled in groups, either a family group or alongside other family groups for reasons of safety, usually travelling with very few possessions, not even carrying food or water to keep their loads light. Transportation with or without smugglers was typically on foot for large sections of the journey. Those with access to greater funds could travel more by car or bus. One woman even travelled by horse. She walked across Iran when she was pregnant, having left Afghanistan, and when she could walk no further, her husband brought a horse for her to ride, to travel across, to continue their journey. Another woman spoke about crossing the border from Bulgaria into Serbia. She travelled in a car which a smuggler had arranged. The seats had been taken out in the back, and there were so many people squashed into this one car, and it was so overcrowded that she was absolutely convinced at that point she would lose the baby because she was pregnant at the time. Women spoke about the trauma of not only personal suffering, but witnessing the suffering of others as well, such as witnessing rape and death while they were on the way, which was very traumatic for them. In the slide, you can see on the left-hand side, there's a picture, and this is a picture of the Turkey-Iran border and the multiple deaths. It just shows the multiple deaths that occur at borders. And the right-hand photograph, the arrivals terminal in Belgrade Airport, you can just about make out a poster advertising help for refugees arriving by plane. But for Afghans travelling by plane into Serbia isn't an option. So thinking now about what it's like for women as they travel through or stay for some time in Serbia. And I've used the term contradictory hospitality here really to describe how Afghan women are both welcomed and given refuge, and yet also punished in some respects for travelling through Serbia as a result of the EU migration policy. So hospitality exists, but only on certain terms, so it's often limited. And the factors that influence this are I found were economic, social, and the political climate. So some participants I spoke with highlighted the fact that Serbia, as a middle income country, doesn't necessarily have the resources to adequately deal with refugees, including specifically healthcare systems to meet refugee health needs. Obviously, that includes maternity care as well, other than what is funded by the EU. And as I mentioned earlier, asylum systems are often poorly functioning, making it very difficult for refugees to seek international protection in Serbia. Additionally, both migrant solidarity as well as far-right anti-migrant extremism coexist in Serbia, which can really complicate local communities' relationships with refugee populations. And I'm very conscious here that I'm speaking to a group of Serbians about Serbia, so I'll be interested in comments, certainly at the end of this presentation, on what I have to say. In my research, I found that there are various spaces that Afghan women occupied while in Serbia, and I describe these as spaces of movement and spaces of fallback. So here I contrast spaces that Afghan women occupied that either facilitated onward movement versus spaces they occupied when they either needed to or were essentially forced to pause their journeys. Spaces of movement were spaces that facilitated onward movement due to its proximity to borders or access to smugglers or transportation hubs. Occupying these spaces, which could be squats set up in abandoned buildings or tents in border areas or tents set up near transport hubs, frequently meant being penalised by the state through either the police actively damaging or removing people's possessions, removing access to clean water, or restricting the provision of humanitarian assistance to people in these locations. For example, one Afghan woman I spoke with told me that when she was heavily pregnant, she was staying in tents along with her family on the Serbian-Hungarian border just inside Serbia. Her family were getting ready to cross the border into Hungary, but after her brother had extensively pleaded with and finally arranged for her to have some maternity care in a local hospital, while she was in hospital receiving her maternity care, the police came and deliberately damaged the tents in which her family was staying. Her wider family proceeded immediately then to cross the border and eventually arrived and settled in Austria. But the lady I spoke with stayed back with her brother due to being heavily pregnant and gave birth shortly afterwards. So this really illustrates how this illustrates how the police were making it very difficult for people who stayed in this kind of informal squats. What's more, non-emergency healthcare, including routine maternity care, was restricted to those registered with Serbian authorities and staying in camps, where they could access maternity care via doctors located within camps. So this excludes women who choose to stay outside camps from accessing other than non-emergency care, basically for labour and birth. So those who were staying outside camps were completely excluded. And I then describe spaces of fallback as being spaces entered and indeed re-entered when onward movement was curtailed, for example, due to health reasons, needing to rest or needing to acquire funds and save up for onward journeys. But inevitably, occupying these spaces, in turn, often caused the further slowing of journeys, which is why some women and families opted to avoid them altogether, despite the fact it meant they wouldn't be able to access maternity care. I found that these spaces varied widely from very welcoming environments in which women were able to put aside the challenges of life in Serbia, or where at least life was made more bearable, to camps in which suffering or violence was reproduced through substandard material conditions, overcrowding, and lack of personal safety for women. Staying in such substandard camps had a huge impact on the well-being of childbearing women, particularly affecting their mental health. But one woman, really interestingly, had a positive experience of staying in the camp while she was pregnant and after she gave birth, really citing the camp manager and other camp staff as being key to ensuring she was well cared for and supported. She said, when a woman gives birth, she doesn't just need facilities, she needs care and love. They didn't just give you things you need, but they gave you special love when you gave birth to a child there. So it goes to show that things can be positive for women staying in refugee camps. But this experience was very unique among women I spoke with. Most women found living in refugee camps unbearable when they were pregnant or had a newborn baby. All Afghan women I spoke with in camps in Serbia planned to leave Serbia. It was just a matter of when and how. And hope for an improved future for their children was really instrumental in giving them the determination required to do conditions in Serbia and continue their onward difficult journeys. However, crossing Serbia's borders to get to EU member states frequently led to Afghan women being pushed back or forcibly returned to Serbia, which often involved border police violence and brutality, despite the fact they were pregnant or travelling with newborns. For example, one woman told me about how she and her family went on the game repeatedly to try and leave Serbia. She had 3 young children and they tried to cross the borders both while she was pregnant, including when she was heavily pregnant, and then afterwards with her newborn. They made, I think, about 10 or 12 attempts to cross the border. They did finally cross the border, but it took a lot of attempts to do so. And she describes on one occasion her interaction with the Croatian border police after she'd crossed into Croatia. She says, we dropped our baby at the feet of the police. Please help us, please let us go. But they didn't let us go. And then they deported us at 2 o'clock in the night. And then they dropped us somewhere we didn't know. This was back in Serbia. And we didn't know where we should go at 2 o'clock in the night. So in the middle of the night, they just found themselves in the middle of nowhere in Serbia. They did eventually make their way to a camp and was able to stay there for another few days. But one thing I really want to emphasise here is that far from being passive victims, as they are too often portrayed to be, Afghan women were very, very much active in their migration journeys and choices about migration and crossing borders. So they were active in making decisions and taking steps to ensure the protection for themselves and their families. So the next question I asked was, how do Afghan women in Serbia experience the perinatal care period and maternity care in Serbia? And to discuss this with you now, I want to refer to a webcomic I developed as part of a public engagement project. I won't have time today to really talk in full about the public engagement project in detail, but just to mention that as part of it, we use the webcomic to elicit questionnaire responses from Serbian healthcare professionals and members of women's civil society organisations. And we've published a paper about this, which I've put here, which you can look at if you're interested. But the webcomic was developed really with the aim of visually representing Afghan women's experiences in Serbia. And they were developed from narrative interviews and finding common threads running through the interviews I did with Afghan women and pulling those common threads together to form a composite narrative. I involved a group of Afghan women throughout the process to provide feedback at various stages of the webcomic development. So from the development of the script and then the visual representation of that's in the webcomic. And they gave their feedback on how the webcomic represents their experiences. And the webcomic, which is available on the web link you can see there, is available, has been translated into Dari, Serbian and English. So firstly, one of the things that really came through very clearly from interviews with Afghan women was that their narratives of childbearing were very much part of their broader migration narratives. They weren't seen as a separate event, but they were very much intertwined with their migration journeys. Women spoke of the impact of being pregnant while travelling through Serbia, often having to temporarily curtail their journeys in order to give birth and rest after the birth. And they talked about the removal of hope for a better future that resulted from having to stop travelling. Sometimes this led to depression during pregnancy or after the birth, as they were unable to see how their journeys would continue. There was a huge physical toll on women during childbearing, having to run from border police while pregnant, walking for hours on foot, as I've already alluded to. Sometimes this was in extreme heat and other times in freezing weather through snow, having to continue travelling within days of giving birth, and the difficulties of carrying babies for long distances. But as I've said before, this was really fueled by hope for a better future, which is illustrated in this quote by one of the Afghan women when she said, She had already arrived and settled in Germany, but reflecting back on her experiences, she said, "I'm sick physically and mentally, and I still haven't fully recovered. The challenges made me so sensitive, and I cry at the slightest problem. Nevertheless, I endured the immigration challenges because I had two children. I had my family, and mostly because of my children, I said to myself, I'm their mother. With all these problems, I have to bring them to a good place to have a better future." I've already mentioned the substandard conditions within camps, but additionally, many women experienced a real failure of camps to take into account their needs as pregnant women or newborn mothers to newborns, or to take into account their maternal or newborn health needs. And while the refugee camps have doctors that women can visit, the camp doctors didn't actually directly provide, they don't directly provide maternity care, but instead they refer women to local hospitals for their maternity care. And for antenatal care, women weren't able to directly self-refer. They were reliant on the camp doctors referring them, and then on transportation being arranged to the hospitals. And often women, the antenatal appointments would only take place when there was a group of women that would be transported together. So sometimes if a woman felt that she needed to be seen urgently for antenatal care, she wasn't able, she had to wait until other women were travelling to the hospital. And postnatal care within camps was almost non-existent. UNICEF had set up mother and baby corners that provided advice and support for mothers with babies in camps, but the management of these has been transferred to the state, and since which many have ceased to operate fully or function at all. And one Afghan woman I spoke to talked about her distress, her real distress caused by a lack of adequate infant feeding support within the camp. She said, in the nursery, that's the mother and baby corner, they asked us to bring the bottle with you. And then they gave us a certain amount of milk, which they said should have been enough for 4 hours. But between this, if we go again and tell them, he's crying, he's hungry, they said, no, don't come again. I gave it to you just 1 hour before, don't come again. There were no clothes, no nappies. They had a lot of support from everywhere, but they didn't give it to us. There was no food. We were not allowed to cook. We had our own food from the camp, and we knew that was the situation with the camp and the food. So yeah, it was not good facilities. I was really sad about it. When she talks about it, she's talking about a restricted access to formula milk for her son. And every time I said, oh, I wish I was dead and I was not coming in this situation. So this really illustrates how difficult life was for childbearing women and new mothers staying within the camps. Another thing I found from interviewing and speaking with Afghan women was that they were continually having to navigate multiple layers of control placed upon them. This is both at the regional level, navigating the control on their movements into the EU imposed by the EU border regime. At the state level, navigating controls placed by Serbian authorities on their accommodation. Women were frequently having to be relocated between camps and moving irrespective of their own wishes. And also controls within systems of maternity care, which is what I'll focus on a bit more now. So as is the case with Serbian women, Afghan women weren't allowed a birth companion or indeed a translator with them during labour and birth. Being in a new country, unable to speak the language, this made labour and birth extremely frightening for them. They were unable to communicate with health professionals and had no understanding of what clinical procedures were being conducted. We have plenty of evidence to show that having support from a companion of choice for women in labour is associated with improved maternal outcomes and satisfaction. And indeed, the World Health Organization considers this to be a vital component of quality of care. Being deprived of this basic right constitutes obstetric violence, a term that O'Brien and Rich describe as harm inflicted during or in relation to pregnancy, childbearing, and the postpartum period. In addition, many women's birth narratives included having their newborn removed immediately after birth. As many of them have previously given birth in Afghanistan, they were accustomed to being handed their baby straight after birth, as well as being surrounded by female relatives. And a number of women told me that they thought their baby had died because they were separated from them after birth. In fact, in many hospitals, it was routine practice to take newborns to a nursery away from the mother postnatally as well, bringing them to the mother only for breastfeeding. And again, there is a large body of evidence to show the harm that separating mothers and newborns causes. in relation to bonding and establishing breastfeeding, among other things. So to illustrate this control placed on women's access to their newborns, I'll just read off this quote from one woman. She said, "They brought my baby tied up with a cloth and I didn't see his hands and feet for 20 days. When the nurse was out, I was opening the cloth that was tied up. I wanted to see his feet, but they came and argued. They said, 'You have no right to open the baby's cloth, just breastfeed him.'" For some women, having to negotiate these zones of control resulted in them speaking out and advocating for themselves in order to have their needs met. But these women tended to already have a greater degree of cultural or social capital. This was certainly not the case for all women. One woman with whom I spoke had previously had some uterine surgery in Iran that precluded her from having a vaginal birth. But this wasn't understood by the health professionals caring for her during labour and birth. And she described how she had to self-advocate, and it was really very traumatic for her having to do so. She says, "After I told them my problem and they didn't understand, they tried to deliver the baby normally and I was crying. Finally, I took my phone and wrote in translation in my language to Serbian that I have this problem and I can't normally give birth to a baby. Please help me." During this process, I always called my husband and asked him to go and tell them to send me a translator, do something for me or call me, and they completely rejected my husband. They, that's the camp doctors, said, "Don't come again about this problem. We can't do anything." When the main doctor came and I told her everything about these problems, then she said, "Okay, that's all right, we'll do something." So you can see here, this woman was literate. She was able to use Google Translate to communicate the fact that she was unable to have a vaginal birth, but not every woman was in the position to do that. And finally, something that emerged from my research was that for some women, contrary to the dominant narratives that exist about pregnancy or having a newborn being solely undesirable or burdensome during migration, some women's experiences were much more nuanced. And while it was certainly extremely challenging for many women to be pregnant or care for a newborn while on the move through Serbia, for some women it also brought them a comfort and distractions from the daily difficulties they were facing. So the last question I asked in this research project were, what are the experiences and perspectives of clinical and non-clinical actors providing perinatal care and support to Afghan women during migration through Serbia? And we published a paper on this, which outlines our findings if you're interested in having a look at it. In addition to some of the things I've already previously mentioned, one of the things that we found that I found in talking to actors was that providing maternity care and support to a highly mobile group had its specific challenges. It was difficult to build relationship with women when care providers sometimes only had hours or days with women before they moved on. And some actors felt helpless to provide the support they wanted to within the context of the existing migration governance, which was challenging when they witnessed women suffering, for example, having miscarriages due to running from border guards or being told to give sleeping syrup to their newborns when crossing borders so as not to alert border police. And this clearly placed a strain on those providing care and support to childbearing Afghan women. But some actors also resisted the constraints placed upon them by migration controls. So, for example, they would provide support to women as they continue their journey, after they'd left the camp and as they continued their journey, by providing telephone support, and they were able to, in that way, provide ongoing support and signpost them to services remotely. And some NGO actors provided support to women staying outside camps, which was not permitted by the Serbian state and at great personal risk to themselves, even being held at gunpoint by Serbian police. But they did develop strategies to continue to provide humanitarian assistance, very much under the radar though. Interviews with clinical and non-clinical actors really revealed the enablers and barriers to accessing and using maternity care that women face. And many non-clinical actors who provided support to childbearing Afghan women played a vital role in advocating between healthcare providers and women themselves in order to mitigate state restrictions on maternity care, forming what Vanessa Grossi and her colleagues termed networks of care. Even though this wasn't clinical care, it very much formed part of the maternity care, and without which maternity care may not have been possible. For example, interpreters attending hospital appointments with women went far beyond their role to ensure that women received adequate care. And in other instances, NGO staff would advocate for women on practical issues such as appointment times, reasons as to why women are unable to take certain medications, or helping with transportation to hospital appointments, bridging an important gap between women and clinical staff. And finally, specifically for NGO actors, they were finding they were supporting women in a landscape of constant change, which is really challenging. So there have been huge temporal and spatial changes to numbers of childbearing Afghan women in camps, meaning that they had to constantly adapt their programming. And currently, I understand that the numbers of Afghan women staying in camps are far fewer than they have previously been. COVID-19 had a huge impact on the ways in which NGO actors provided support to Afghan women. They had to switch to remote methods during the fact that migrants in Serbia were placed under strict quarantine in camps during periods of lockdown. Some of these changes were viewed as positive, such as training a small group of women in camps to act as key contact points for other women, but providing such high levels of support, which included 24/7 telephone support, was also seen as very personally demanding. NGO actors were constantly having to adapt their projects in response to changing donor funding, and that was a big issue. Some projects were only funded for 3 to 6 months, resulting in significant instability of services they were providing. And this was really further compounded by waning public and media interest in the so-called EU migration crisis, and a diversion of funds towards Ukrainian refugees, which has also resulted in a lack of funding for projects supporting Afghan women. So just as I start to conclude, I want to pull together some recommendations and what does all this mean in practice. And ultimately, the EU needs to end their exclusionary and violent border regime that's founded along racialized lines. Safe routes for travel must be established to enable Afghan women and newborns and others seeking international protection to do so without experiencing multiple harms along the way. Serbian migration governance, in response to external EU pressures as well as internal anti-migrant sentiment, must remove exclusionary policies of those who are or who are not entitled to routine maternity care to ensure that all women can receive a comprehensive package of maternity care from conception to 6 weeks post-birth, in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 3.7 that sets out the requirement for universal access to reproductive health services alongside the human right to accessing healthcare. It's imperative that Serbian health systems implement a system of humanised care for women in labour and birth, ending the restriction on birth companions and separation of mothers and newborns, and that mothers and newborns remain together throughout their stay in hospital in order to bond and establish breastfeeding. So just to conclude now, Afghan women's childbearing experiences, hopefully I've shown, are highly shaped by their migratory experiences. They're not passive actors, but they travel through Serbia within constraints and a constraining and restrictive system that ultimately causes harms to many childbearing women and their newborns. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esther. I have a lot of questions, but first I'd like to now give the floor to Professor Natalia Peričić from the Faculty of Political Science. She will be at the serve as a discussant for today, and Natalia will have about 10-15 minutes to give her perspective. Natalia, could you tell us a little bit more about the network that you also have, maybe just in the beginning? And then I will open the floor for questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Esther, for giving this wonderful presentation and for doing this kind of research, Thank you also for sending me the articles, because there are so many data in articles. And when I say data, I think on the quotes of women, I think on the description and analysis of the situation. And it is so rich that it would be really very nice for everybody interested in this topic to get through the articles, because I also got many other information and data from the articles on top of this, what Esther presented today. So what was the most, what was the first thing that struck me here is actually the description and analysis of all these interactions and all the intersections of female bodies, of childbirth, childbearing on the one hand, and on the other hand, migration, displacement, and refuge, about vulnerabilities and violence, but also resilience and agency. And for me, everything was very important because I come from a background of a social worker. And actually what Ljiljana said now to introduce a little bit about the network, it has to do a lot with social work and this kind of things. In October 2019, I started coordinating a Horizon 2020 project. Its abbreviation was MIGREC, and MIGREC is today Migration, Integration and Governance Research Center that we were able to establish at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade. You can find our website. And it was done in collaboration with, among other, our colleagues from the University of Sheffield. And that is how Esther and me get to know each other. Currently, we are in the process of doing two big things for us. One is organizing a summer school on forced displacement together with the Boston University. You can also find information about that on our website. And the other thing is that we are exploring Europe and Africa migration ties and trying to see what can be done in terms of migration patterns and what is in their background among Europe, not only European Union, but also Europe and Africa. So, Ljiljana, thank you very much. So what I would like to put here, basically two big things and a couple of things that could spread the discussion. And these, let's say, minor things are a bit, at least, controversial. So the first thing is about the Western Balkans route, which was already explained by Esther. And actually, Serbia was and is still a part of the Western Balkans route. And it was one of three migration routes for the migrants from the region of Middle East and North Africa, as we put it in political science. And it meant that people from this region, including Afghanistan, transited Turkey, Greece, North Macedonia, and Serbia in order to enter the EU. And it was either Hungary or Croatia. And it was actually, the route started to be, let's say, heavily used since 2012, and especially during the migration peak, and it was 2015 and 2016. And what were the main reasons for its usage? It was actually less dangerous than the migration routes through the Mediterranean Sea. It would be, I mean, this is not to say that it was not dangerous, not at all, and contrary. And there was so much violence and all the things on the route, but in comparison with the transit through the Mediterranean Sea, it was less dangerous. And not only that, but during the migration peak, it was rather fast. Migrants were able to transit Serbia from 1 to 3 days and to get into the European Union. Then the route was officially closed in March 2016 when the EU-Turkey deal was signed, and it actually brought some additional challenges, meaning that the number of people was decreased, but the length of their stay was increased. And it was a real challenge for Serbia because Serbia was, let's say, rather good in this first urgent humanitarian aid giving to refugees. But when it came, and that is a situation now to enable longer term care and support to migrants, it looks that the things are not functioning very well. So there was a lot of estimations on the number of people transiting, especially during the migration crisis peak. And these estimations differ very much depending on the source. But what is reliable are data of the state bodies regarding the numbers of asylum seekers. But on the other hand, these data, even though they are solid, they are not very good because not everybody is registered as asylum seeker, and it brings a lot of challenges on the one hand, but when it comes to the registered numbers of asylum seekers, actually people from Afghanistan were, they presented 1/4 of the whole number of asylum seekers in 2015. And after that, from 2016 until 2022, the last data are for 2022, migrants from Afghanistan are actually the major part of people transiting to Serbia. For example, the lowest number of persons from Afghanistan who were registered as asylum seekers was in 2018, and it was only 31% of them. And in 2020, there were more than half people of all migrants were from Afghanistan. But another thing that was already shared by Esther is that we do not have, at least publicly, data which are segregated based on gender for the countries. We have in general numbers of men and women and children and so on, but not regarding we do not have gender segregated data per country. Contrary to, and we can open the question of the asylum seeking system and why it looks that it is made to be non-effective. It is not effective. The procedures are very complicated. They are very long. Asylum office is constantly understaffed. Esther was mentioning COVID period. It was not functional at all during the COVID, and there are many things that look to discourage migrants to actually obtain the status of a refugee in Serbia. So we have some solid data which are rather non-specific from the governmental bodies from the one hand, but on the other hand, we have some data from the non-governmental organizations, be they domestic or international. There was some research, and also some of these relate to Afghanistan women, and these are actually very much in line in what was Esther talking about, the things that were going on in the field with women. One of the things that is very important for me to highlight now is actually what can be seen in the field regarding the life of pregnant and childbearing women in the camps, contrary to their life in the squats. Yes, there are rules for their life in the camps. There are some good and some bad sides of living in the camps, but I think that what I was able to see, at least, was rather heavily engagement of UNICEF and also national domestic non-governmental organizations, which are rather active in supporting pregnant women. On the other hand, those who are still living in the squats, and they do that because it looks they do not have another alternative. They have to rely on smugglers. And this was one of the most poignant challenges that we saw in the field, that unaccompanied children, young women, young men, they rely on smugglers. And smugglers are person who they trust. And this is actually very problematic, in my opinion, and it shows how well-designed policies actually work against people. And on the one hand, on the other hand, the state is criminalizing solidarity with migrants to the maximum extent, and the things are rather complicated, especially during some pre-election periods and that kind of things. Another thing that I wanted to touch upon is actually the legal framework regarding the healthcare and regarding the migrants and asylum seeker. So Serbia signed almost all international conventions, including those that protect maternity. It is also devoted to the realization of sustainable development goals. Some of them relate to maternity, some of them relate to health, some of them relate to migrants. So it is, let's say, covered. We also have national regulations, and they, let's say, guarantee the right to healthcare to all migrants. Not only that, but they guarantee that asylum seekers are in an equal position with the Serbian nationals regarding health care. Despite his legal status, each person has the right to health care. This is in the regulations. We also have bylaws, and they regulate health care of migrants. And one of the first striking things is that pregnant women are totally excluded from the bylaws, and they are not mentioned in any way. Not only that their pregnancy is not regulated, but also the vaccination of children and all the things that are in connection. So on the other hand, we have a lot of reports by non-governmental organizations, but alerting that there are so many unwanted pregnancies that could be a result of rape, which is, of course, not reported because there is no way to make evidence and that kind of things. And that actually, when it comes to abortion, that legal rules seem to look very complicated for migrant women, even though it is not said in the constitution and in the legal pieces in such way. And there are a lot of evidence that when migrant women were not able to pay for the abortion, that it was actually paid by non-governmental organizations, that there were illegal abortions and that kind of things. Also, when it comes to giving birth to a child, there are reports that migrant women very frequently came to maternity wards when the process of giving birth to a child was already started. Also, that there are no evidence that they actually had 8 preventive medical checkups at the primary level of healthcare in Serbia, as it is provided for all pregnant women in Serbia. But also there are some positive developments that are reported in Serbia, at least. And one of these is the functioning of the maternity home, which is embedded into the system of social care in Serbia, which supports mothers who cannot, who do not have any place for living after they give birth to a child in Serbia. And this was also provided for migrant women. And this was presented as rather, let's say, positive practice that was enabled to migrant women to have, to stay with their children after to stay with their child after giving a birth, to enable a mother to develop ties with the child and that kind of things. And finally, one of the things that struck me during Esther's presentation was something that is very high on the agenda in Serbia, and it is, if I'm not wrong with my English, it is framed under the so-called obstetric violence, and it has to do with the behaviors of medical doctors and nurses during in maternity wards during childbirth. It has a lot to do with the domestic population, and we can only suppose how it is when it comes to migrant women on the one hand. On the other hand, the National Institute for the Public Health, they release each year reports on the satisfaction of users, of patients with the health care. And for years, ever since this satisfaction of patients was surveyed, actually female patients who are giving childbirths in Serbia are least satisfied with the national system of healthcare. So we know that we have to work much more in order to really show human dignity to women who are giving birth to their children, and also to mention this, what Esther said, not to have disrespectful but respectful maternity. So I hope we can have discussion because there were so many things Esther mentioned, and we could explore many of them.
Completely agree. Thank you so much, Natalia, for providing this useful both background into the Serbian context, but also into the wider framework of migration and problems with both the normative framework and what happens in practice aspects of migration at large, and then the healthcare system. So I would like to open the floor to our audience, but I would also try to sort of usurp the moment and ask the first question if Esther doesn't mind. I really, really appreciated this talk. Also, Natalia's contextualization of it and coming back to the questions about how maternal care is provided in Serbia. I'm a scholar of that topic myself with the general population. So a lot of the things, as both Natalia and Esther pointed out, are sadly issues that plague all women in Serbia, and it's only highlighted in marginalized and vulnerable groups. And I kept thinking, so I have two questions. Do you have any information about the care or attempts of care that women who are not in the camps, right, who are outside of the formal system looked for? Have any of them sought out private care potentially? Like if there were any questions about those who could afford to do so. And I really appreciate your nuanced description of both different forms of capital, right? Both economic capital and social capital that women have or don't have in approaching the system. So what are those cases for women outside of the camps or even inside of the camps, if for those with economic capital? And I kept thinking about the very opportune situation that the situation when Serbia is currently facing. So we have, as Natalia and Esther noted, a large population of Afghan refugees and migrants on the move. And since the war in Ukraine, we have accepted a lot of Russian refugees coming into the country. So I'm still very puzzled by this, and maybe Esther, your thoughts would be appreciated as well. But keep thinking about questions about race, class, religion, and citizenship, and how they all factor into women's childbirth experiences, especially in countries that they are not a part of. So I guess my question to you would be, can you elaborate a bit more on these different sort of, I wouldn't call them identities, but capitals that women have or don't have, and how they affected their communication? And if you could tell us a little bit more about the provider perspective. So what did they say? A little bit more. Did you talk to the women, the providers in the camps or in the hospitals? What are their perspectives? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really interesting questions to consider. With regards to sort of economic capital and usage of maybe systems of maternity care outside the public system, obviously it's worth mentioning that there are a lot of women who are highly invisibilized, who I wasn't able to include in my research because I had no access to them. So, for example, there are women who stay in smuggler-provided accommodation, and there are women who, even those who sort of are traveling sort of fairly swiftly through Serbia, who may just stay in a forest overnight, one night, and then continue their journey. So their whole journey might take sort of less than 48 hours. So I will say that those voices have not been included in this research. It's very, very difficult to access them. What I gathered from talking with informants, the clinical and non-clinical actors, was that sometimes those in and the other thing to say, actually, sorry, before I say that, is that some women organise private accommodation themselves, or families organise private accommodation themselves. So it may not be a smuggler organised accommodation, but it's still neither squats nor camps. And there are also women who I wasn't able to include, or whose voices aren't represented in this research. But talking to informants, the clinical and non-clinical actors, what I did gather was that it's very unusual for Afghan women to access private maternity care, but certainly there were other refugees from other countries. Syria and Iraq were particularly mentioned to me, and refugees from those countries may more frequently access private maternity care, so that they have the opportunity, as I think you've shown in your research as well, that they have the opportunity to maybe have more continuity of care and overall a sort of better care experience than those using public system. So what I understood from the informants I spoke with was that really Afghan women tend not to have the resources, or certainly tend not to use the resources for private maternity care. Can you remind me, Liliana, what your second question was? I think around sort of around different groups of people and how kind of race and class, etc., intersect with migration. And certainly that's something I've given a lot of thought to in this research. And I think I used sort of two theoretical approaches when I did my research, one of which was a decolonial feminist approach that really sort of centers women's voices, but also looks at intersecting factors, particularly gender and race, and how those intersect to shape migration and in turn shape childbearing experiences. And certainly, I think that, and what we've seen through the Ukraine conflict, is that there are hierarchies of deservingness in terms of access to refugee support in Serbia, and same in the EU, and also to access maternity care. So, and these hierarchies of deservingness are very much built upon racialized lines. So while some can easily access maternity refugee support, others are deprioritized. And I think we've really seen that in the Ukraine conflict, where Ukrainian refugees, and I'm not so familiar with the Russian refugees in Serbia, but I suspect it's similar, refugees that look like us, maybe white-skinned refugees, are seen as more deserving, whereas those coming from the global south are deprioritized and not seen as deserving for the same level of support, or for international protection, or for entry into the EU. So I don't know if that answers your question about that.
Perfect, yes. Thank you. So I would like to open the floor, thank you so much, Esther, to our audience. Are there any thoughts, comments you would like to share? Feel free just to unmute and ask your question. There's no need.
Hello. Hi, I don't know how to, hi Esther, I don't know how to raise my hand now anyway, I'll go ahead and ask my question. So I'm Andrea, and I come from more of a refugee migration background. And I work with mothers in the UK. So they made the journey, and most of them came with their children or gave birth here. So it's a different context. And I had two questions. One, you already kind of answered, but it's also to better understand the specific experiences of Afghan women. So I'm interested in understanding what were the other groups of pregnant women. Were there other groups that were larger than the Afghans? I don't know, the Kurds, Pakistani, I don't know. Who were the other pregnant women? And how were the experience of Afghan women different or not in those interactions, in the care they were given? So what was specific about Afghan women? That's what I think I was missing more from from the presentation, which maybe is in your articles. And then I wanted to pick up on your concept of contradictory hospitality, which I find very interesting because I also work with the concept of hospitality and solidarity, and to understand what was actually happening, like why contradictory. So I guess it's so there was a larger framework of what was allowed, right? And so maybe there was more of less welcoming policy environment versus what was happening on the ground. So how those providing care, dealt with those less hospitable policies. So a little more data on that, if you have any examples, that would be great. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So firstly, to turn to your initial point about different groups of refugee women who are pregnant or give birth. I think my focus in the study was very much, I could have looked at all refugee women that gave birth in Serbia in the study. I specifically chose to focus on Afghan women, firstly because I speak some of the language and I have some level of cultural understanding, having lived in Afghanistan, and on a practical level that really kind of helped to facilitate connections with women and helped to facilitate interviewing women, which was very challenging, took place over 15 months. And the second reason I chose to focus solely on Afghan women was really because there are a lot of studies that group together refugee women as a whole, but maybe don't sort of then pick up on the kind of nuances of country of origin and how that interplays with migratory childbearing experiences. Not that that's wrong or right, it's just a different piece of work. And I think it'd be great to continue to sort of build this research and maybe kind of look at different groups and how they're affected in future. But because that wasn't my focus, I certainly sort of heard things along the way about different groups of women, but it wasn't something I was specifically looking at. For example, when I was during one of my field visits, there was a huge influx of women from Burundi, because Burundian women can enter Serbia visa free. And then just afterwards, I think there was a lot of women from Cuba who were arriving via Russia because, again, of the visa arrangements. But what was quite illuminating was that there were very few services for those women. There were few French interpreters available, and services, certainly the ones I witnessed and visited, were very much geared towards Arabic-speaking women and Dari-speaking women. So a lot of the refugee support services was contingent on what languages were being made available for which women. So almost all the refugee support groups and that I visited were being sometimes had no interpreters at all present, and women sort of muddled through, and other times it was just either Arabic for Arabic speaking women or Dari speaking women. So I don't know if that really answers the question, because it wasn't something I had sort of really focused on. I think that'd be really interesting to explore in future research. But again, as I think I mentioned in response to Liliana's point, there were also, it was sort of insinuated that women from Syria and Iraq had access to greater funds and could afford stay in private accommodation or to have private healthcare that wasn't maybe within the reach of Afghan women. So there were some small things I picked up along the way, but I think certainly it's an area for future research. Can you remind me of your second question again?
It's about your concept of contradictory hospitality.
Yeah.
And how that played out.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So I think I think really it was the idea of contradictory hospitality was that there was hospitality, but it was limited. It was constrained. It was hospitality if you follow the rules. So, you know, and an example of that is you can access maternity care as long as you're registered with state authorities or you stay in camps. If you don't follow the rules, then you can't. You don't get the privileges of maternity care, for example. I'm trying to think of another example. Oh, another thing that I didn't really sort of specifically talk about too much in my presentation was about the provision of refugee support, which I think Natalia did mention and touch on briefly. So the state has limited refugee support to those only staying within camps, or to groups who are working to signpost people to camps. So again, that's again another example of the contradictory hospitality. We can provide all the support you want, but you have to follow our rules. If you want to stay outside camps, you don't get the access to the support. You don't get some of the privileges. I use that term sort of slightly cautiously, that you do if you're staying within a camp. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Esther.
I think we have time for
Lilio, if I can add only something, because I also don't know how to raise my hand. This contradictory hospitality is really something that is very worrisome. And on the one hand, it has to do with the European Union, and then on the other hand, it doesn't have to do with the European Union. Esther put that perfectly in her graphic design, that the Serbian migration policy has a lot, that it actually follows the requirements of the European Union. And for at least two reasons I'm thinking about now. And one is to have a good image of good guys, us as Serbians, and the other is to approach to the European Union funds for the migrants, because the majority of them came from the European Union. And then there is that narrative, which is not only a narrative. These are people's life. You have that narrative from the highest level officials in Serbia. We are respecting genuine wishes of, as we call them, irregular migrants. Their genuine wish is to transit. And for that reason, we are letting people transit. They don't want to stay. And for that reason, we won't force them to stay. But then, at the moment, the highest rank officials become concerned because the EU is closed, and it becomes to close its borders very quickly, That moment, they become concerned that the migrants are to stay. You have the then Minister of the Interiors who says we are not a parking lot for the migrants. And also, as I said, we have that continuous criminalization of solidarity with migrants, put to us as citizens from the highest level officials. So it is, don't help the migrants. It is illegal. Don't give them this, don't give them that. So there are so many things bound in this complicated.
Do we have any more comments or questions from the audience?
Good morning. Hi, I'm Rebecca Lubin-Sharman. Just a brief introduction. I actually helped Esther with her research as a translator, and I'm also a former student of the Medical University, University of Medicine in Belgrade. My question was both to Esther Sharma and to Natalia Perušić. What do you guys both think would be the best means to now make maternity care better, not just for migrant women who are coming into the country, just obviously we're specifically talking about Afghan women, but obviously a general consensus for all migrants would be interesting to hear from both of you, and also how to make the maternity care for just Serbian women better, because that's as you said, it's a global issue that has been a problem, not for it's been an ongoing problem for decades now, and also we have a lack of resources within Belgrade hospitals and stuff like that. So I'd love to see, what do you both think would be the best means to start repairing this relationship between doctors and patients, and how would the different budgets or different schemes work best in Serbia?
Natalia, would you like to start, and I can follow?
Esther, thank you very much. Rebecca, thank you very much for the question, but I don't know the answer. I think that this topic was neglected for decades. And the first thing would be to acknowledge that the things are not good, and not to put them under the carpet, as we say it in Serbia, that we are hiding secrets and that we are acting like nobody saw an elephant, pink elephant, in the room. There have been so many reforms in the whole healthcare sector, but I don't know for their outcomes and their improvements. I personally lately have trust only for something outside the system to change it. I would rely very much on some kind of female movements advocating for their rights and negotiating, and also making the whole healthcare system more transparent in terms of maternity procedures and that kind of things. But we have also very influential neoliberal ideas how you should pay everything and everything will be good. And I'm convinced that this doesn't solve the problem at all. So I'm very sorry for not giving the answer, but just thinking.
No, I understand completely, because obviously I have internshipped in some of our maternity wards in Belgrade, and I have firsthand seen certain treatments and also lack of equipment and accessibility to certain doctors. So I know that there is a big struggle happening on not just maternity wards, but across the board in most medical fields and medical institutions. So it's really, I understand that there's a big problem currently posing in Serbia in terms of what is the best way to go about this kind of situation, and how to also change patient care and how to improve it significantly.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you for all your help with the research project as well. And I'm very nervous to comment when I've got Liliana here, who is an expert on this topic about maternity care in Serbia. But just briefly to speak to the point about what would improve things for refugee women, and certainly I think having a translator is an absolute basic. I mean, it's an absolute fundamental basic to have somebody to interpret for them. So at the very basic level they can communicate should be an absolute non-negotiable. And as I mentioned, having a birth companion is, the evidence is really, really clear that provides a huge amount of support to women during labour and birth. And I've already spoken about the issue of separation, not separating mothers and babies. The only other thing I would really add, which I'd be actually interested to hear what Liliana has to say about this, is the introduction of a regulated midwifery service in Serbia at the minute. There are midwives, but they're operating within the medical model, and they're not, as far as I understand, they're not a separate, distinct profession, and they're certainly not midwifery-led care. But we know the evidence is very clear that midwifery-led care not only can help improve outcomes, but provide women with a far more dignified and humanised experience of birth. But I'm treading on eggshells here because I know that there are other experts in the room. So
I think you just opened the idea for another discussion that we can have definitely on that topic. Are there any? We have maybe room for one more quick question. If not, I'd be happy to sort of close with. I added, just because this is Esther's talk and I really don't want to usurp your time, I've added so in April, finally, the publication that my colleague Jelena Cheriman and Biljana Stankovic and I completed in the summer last year about the experiences of women in maternity hospitals in Serbia during and after COVID is finally out. Currently, I think the version available is only in Serbian. So if you speak Serbian, that's available too. But keep an eye out on that webpage. It should be also in English as well. And there, actually, we do have 40 different recommendations to improve maternal health care, specifically divided into care recommendations for the Ministry of Health, recommendations for individual maternity hospitals, and then recommendations to individual doctors as well. Esther mentioned some of them. I think there is one more question in the chat. Yes, Esther, could you please share your articles here in the chat before we go so people can have them
certainly
take away?
Yeah,
that would be really useful. And Esther, I really appreciate your question and comment, and it is something to think about. I'll just give you one piece of information, or lack of information, as we noted here in your talk, and Natalia's observations as well, is that there is no gender desegregated data. There's also no desegregated data for nurses, because we have actually nurse midwives, so they're not a separate vocational training, and we do not actually have publicly available data on how many midwives there are in Serbia and how many of them work in maternity hospitals. So getting adequate data would be one thing to start from, and I think we have a topic to discuss for the future about sort of the role of midwives in different contexts and the importance of midwives. So hopefully that's another topic to have maybe in the next term, academic term, to talk about more. And I would really love to hear more of your insights as well, Esther, from the UK perspective. I want to thank you all for this really great panel and talk. Esther, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful, I think it was noted amongst others, very rich discussion, very important one. So it highlights the struggles that the people face on the road, and the issues that we are not actually dealing with is how care is provided, not just immediate or acute care, but chronic care and continuity of care that is needed in order to, it's not easy to move from your own country and then actually have some dignity with you as well on the road is something that we should all strive to help and achieve. So thank you so much for sharing the stories of these women. I think that's very important. We will post this on our YouTube channel, hopefully by next week. So stay tuned. I posted the link to our channel in the chat, and I think we can make it publicly available. Esther will also share it when it is available. So thank you so much for taking the time with us. It was an hour and a half of really insightful, not easy to digest topics, but important ones to talk about. So thank you so much, Esther. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, everyone, for joining the discussion, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liliana.
Oh, thank you. I think we can, let me see.